When a hand-stitched leather bag arrived at the San Francisco Luxury Goods Summit in a battered cardboard box held together with packing tape, the room didn't go quiet. It laughed. The man carrying it didn't look like he belonged there. He wore a flannel shirt with a frayed collar, work boots that had never been polished, and the kind of calloused hands that came from decades of doing something with them. He was holding the hand of his 8-year-old granddaughter, who clutched a stuffed horse under one arm and looked at the marble lobby with enormous eyes, like she was trying to memorize it. Nobody expected what was inside that box. Nobody expected that the bag he'd spent 4 years stitching alone in a shed behind his house in rural Tennessee would make the most celebrated leather designers in the country go very, very quiet, in a completely different way. But that story begins the way most important stories do, with someone deciding that a person wasn't worth taking seriously. The security checkpoint at the Meridian Hotel's grand entrance had seen a lot in 20 years of hosting the summit. Hedge fund managers who arrived by helicopter. European fashion houses who shipped their entries in climate-controlled cases. Once, a Japanese artisan who flew business class with his tools in a custom-built titanium carry-on. What it had not seen, apparently, was a 63-year-old man from Harlan County with a cardboard box and a granddaughter in pigtails. "Sir." The attendant didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The tone was enough. "Voter registration is around back. This entrance is for invited exhibitors only." Henry Baird set down his box carefully, the way a person sets down something that matters, and reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt. He produced a folded letter, the summit's official letterhead, his name printed clearly in the exhibitor category. The attendant studied it for longer than necessary. "This is in the independent artisan division," the attendant said finally. The way he said it made the category sound like a consolation bracket. "That's right," Henry said. The attendant looked at the cardboard box, then at Henry's granddaughter, who was watching him with the unblinking focus of a child who has learned to read adult behavior very carefully. "You understand this is a competitive event. There are firms here with international distribution. Designers who've been in this industry for 30 years. I've been doing this for 40, Henry said quietly. He was waved through with the particular expression of someone who has decided that what happens next is not their problem. The main exhibition hall of the Meridian was designed to make things look important. High ceilings, recessed lighting angled to catch the sheen of exotic leathers, long tables draped in black linen where finished goods rested under glass. The air smelled of money and conditioning oil, and the particular kind of restrained ambition that gathered whenever very talented people were competing for very limited recognition. Henry found his assigned table near the back. Not the back corner, that would have been almost dignified. His was the table nearest the service corridor, where you could hear the kitchen carts rolling past during setup. His neighbor on the left was a Brooklyn-based design studio, with a team of 4 arranging their display with geometric precision. His neighbor on the right hadn't arrived yet, but their shipping cases were already there, each one labeled with a Paris address. He set the cardboard box on the table and began to unpack. His granddaughter, Bea, short for Beatrice, though she had opinions about when each version applied, pulled herself up to sit on the edge of the table and watched. "Grandpa," she said, "why is our box different from everyone else's? Because I needed to ship something, not impress someone." She considered this with the seriousness of a child who suspects she's being given an answer that will make more sense later. "Are we going to win? We're going to show them what we made. The winning part is up to the judges." What came out of the box was a single handbag. It was made from a piece of full-grain American bison leather that Henry had sourced from a rancher in Montana, tanned using a vegetable process he'd spent 2 years perfecting in his own shed. The color was a deep, warm brown that shifted toward amber in direct light. The stitching was hand-done with waxed linen thread, 18 stitches per inch, every one even, a consistency that required a level of patience most professional ateliers achieved with machines. The hardware was solid brass, fabricated by a metalsmith in Kentucky who'd been making belt buckles for 50 years. The lining was suede, hand-cut from a hide Henry had selected and selected again over the course of 3 visits to the same supplier. It was not a flashy bag. It didn't announce itself. It sat on the table and waited the way a well-made thing can afford to. The Brooklyn studio team glanced over when he set it down. One of them, a young woman with very precise bangs and a tablet perpetually in hand, looked for 2 full seconds before returning to her arrangement. Something in her face shifted, but she didn't say anything. The Paris table's representative arrived 20 minutes later and didn't look at all. At 11 o'clock, Simone Beaumont walked into the exhibition hall. She was known in the industry the way certain people become known, not through any single moment, but through the accumulation of many correct decisions made in public over many years. At 38, she was the founder and CEO of Beaumont Studio, a brand that had started as a single workshop in Chicago's Fulton Market District and grown into something that was regularly described in the press as redefining American luxury. She was sharp-featured, well-dressed in the way that looked effortless because it wasn't, and she moved through the exhibition hall with the ease of someone who understood exactly where she ranked in every room she entered. She had won this competition twice. She was here as both an exhibitor and a member of the advisory panel, which meant she'd spent the morning in meetings where she had significant opinions about criteria and judging methodology. She was the kind of person who had significant opinions about most things and was usually right enough that people listened. She was also, as Henry would later reflect, someone who was fighting something she didn't fully understand yet. She came to his table at 11:30, not because she was drawn to it. She was making a circuit of the hall, the practice survey of someone assessing the competition, but because the circuit included every table and his happened to be last. She stopped. She looked at the bag for a moment, then at Henry, then at Bea, who was drawing horses in a small sketchbook and not paying attention. "Is this your entry?" Simone asked. Her voice was professionally neutral. "Yes, ma'am." She glanced at the table again. The cardboard box was folded neatly beside it. No display stand. No branded card, no tissue paper. Just the bag, sitting on the black linen like it had always been there. "Did you ship it yourself?" "Drove it, actually. Bea and I came up from Tennessee." Simone looked at him for a moment. "That's a long drive, about 14 hours. We stopped in Lexington for the night." There was a pause that had weight to it. Simone picked up the bag. She turned it over once, examined the base, set it back down. Her expression didn't change in any way that was visible, but something in her posture shifted slightly. "The independent artisan category has a $2,000 entry ceiling," she said. "For materials, this bison leather alone, I sourced it myself, direct from the rancher. It comes out differently when you're not buying through a wholesaler." He paused. "I can document the cost if the judges need it." Simone looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at the bag again. Then she smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that was deployed when someone needed to be handled rather than engaged. "You've done impressive work for your level," she said. "Really. The stitching especially. But you should understand what you're competing against here. These are firms with full production facilities, design teams, supplier relationships that took decades to build. You're one person with," she glanced at the cardboard box, "limited resources. I'd manage your expectations." Henry didn't respond immediately. He had a way of absorbing things before he reacted to them, a quality that had either come with age or been there all along. "I appreciate the advice," he said finally. Simone nodded once, the particular nod of someone who considers a matter resolved, and moved on. Bea looked up from her sketchbook. She had been drawing or appearing to draw. Her eyes tracked Simone across the hall. "Grandpa," she said. Was she being nice? Henry thought about this. She was being what she thought was helpful. "That's not the same as nice." "No," he agreed, "it's not." The preliminary judging began at 2 o'clock. Exhibitors presented their work to a rotating panel of 3 judges who moved through the hall station by station. Henry's panel consisted of a materials specialist from a luxury goods association, a retail buyer from a major department store chain, and a craft historian from a design school in New York. They came to his table 40 minutes into the session. The materials specialist picked up the bag first. He was a compact man in his 60s who had spent his career handling leather the way some people handled old manuscripts, with the reverence of someone who understood what they were touching. He turned the bag over once, then again. He looked at the stitching with a small loop he produced from his jacket pocket, examined a seam on the interior, ran his thumb across the brass closure twice. "What tannage process?" he asked. "Vegetable. Extended bark process, about 14 months from hide to finish. I use a formula I've been developing for about 6 years. White oak bark, mimosa, some chestnut. The color develops during tanning rather than being applied after." The specialist looked up. "You're running your own tannery?" "I built a small operation in my shed. It's not commercial scale. It's enough." There was a silence that felt different from the one that followed most answers. The specialist set the bag down very carefully. "How long have you been working leather?" the craft historian asked. She was younger than the other two, and she had been watching Henry with an expression of steady attention since they arrived at his table. "Since I was 19. I apprenticed with a saddle maker in eastern Kentucky for about 4 years, then worked for a tack shop, then started doing custom work on my own. Mostly Western goods, saddles, belts, boots. I moved into structured bags about 8 years ago." He paused. "After my wife passed." The historian made a note. Not the kind of note that was just for appearances. She actually wrote something. The brass hardware, the retail buyer said. He was the most skeptical of the three, or at least the most commercially minded. Custom fabricated by a man named Dale Hutchins is out of Corbin, Kentucky. He's been doing metalwork for 50 years. I drew the design. We made about 30 prototypes before we got the weight right. The weight? The closure has to have a specific weight or it doesn't sound right when it latches. That took a while to dial in. The buyer looked at him. You tested for sound. Everything matters. The three judges exchanged a glance that Henry didn't try to interpret. They spent another 12 minutes at his table, significantly longer than their average, which he could tell by the polite impatience of the Brooklyn studio team waiting for them at the next station. When they left, Bea put down her sketchbook. Did that go okay? She asked. I think so. You were nervous. A little. Grandma used to say being nervous means you care about something. Henry looked at her. She had her grandmother's eyes and her grandmother's habit of saying things that landed exactly right without seeming to try. She was right about that, he said. So it's okay to be nervous about things you care about? Yeah, sweetheart. That's exactly right. The competition's social hour was held in the hotel's atrium at 5 o'clock. Henry left Bea with a coloring book and a plate of appetizers at a corner table and circulated, which was not his natural instinct, but seemed like the correct thing to do. He shook hands with people who looked at his badge, and then at his flannel shirt, and then back at his badge in a way that was probably not intentional. He had a brief, surprisingly easy conversation with the Brooklyn Studios founder, the one with the precise bangs, whose name was Jess, who turned out to have grown up in rural Virginia and recognized the kind of sourcing process Henry was describing. They talked about tanneries for 15 minutes, and she gave him her card. He was getting a glass of water when Simone Beaumont appeared beside him. She looked different than she had in the exhibition hall. Not softer exactly, but less certain of something. She was holding a glass of wine and not drinking it. I owe you an apology, she said, without preamble. Henry waited. What I said this afternoon about managing your expectations, that was condescending. I was looking at your box and your... She gestured vaguely at his shirt. And I made a decision about who you were before I looked at what you made. She paused. That bag is extraordinary. I want you to know I understand that. What changed your mind? I picked it up again after the judging session. I had about 20 minutes and I just held it, examined it properly. She set her wine glass on the bar behind her, the tanning process alone. Do you know how many houses are using synthetic dyes now because the bark process takes too long and costs too much? You spent 14 months on this hide. Nobody does that anymore. It matters for how the leather ages. I know it matters. That's my point. She looked at him directly. I've been in this industry for 15 years. I run a studio with 23 employees. We've won awards. We've been in magazines. She stopped, and I looked at a cardboard box and a flannel shirt, and I decided you weren't worth taking seriously. That's a failure of judgment on my part. Henry considered this. Can I ask you something? Yes. Why are you telling me this? Simone was quiet for a moment. Because my father was a furniture maker, she said. He had a shop in Indiana. Beautiful work, hand-joined, traditional joinery, the kind of thing that takes a year to complete one piece. He submitted to a design show once when I was about your granddaughter's age. The selection committee sent back a form letter, didn't even make the first round. She looked across the atrium. He never submitted anything again. Henry didn't say anything. I became what I am by being the person who recognized quality before other people did, she said. That's supposed to be the whole point, and I walked right past you this morning. She picked up her wine glass again. So I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know you're competing for something real, and because I'd rather be the version of myself that admits when she's wrong. It was the kind of honesty Henry hadn't expected from someone in her position, and he found he didn't have an easy response to it. He understood people who carried their fathers. He'd been carrying his own for 30 years. My wife was the one who told me to submit, he said finally. I've been making bags for 8 years and I never entered anything. She was sick the last 2 years and she said he stopped, steadied himself. She said I was hiding, that the work deserved to be seen. She didn't live to see me enter. He looked at the atrium, at the white tablecloths and the pale lighting and the carefully dressed industry professionals. So I'm here. Simone was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I'm glad you came. They stood in a silence that was not uncomfortable. The final's tomorrow, she said. If you advance, and I think you will, it's a different kind of pressure. The full panel, the media coverage, buyers from the major retailers. They're going to ask you about production capacity, wholesale pricing, scaling, things that matter for commercial viability. And if I can't scale, then you answer honestly and let the work speak. She looked at him steadily. Your work can speak. Let it. Henry nodded once. Bea appeared at his elbow, having apparently decided the coloring book had reached its natural conclusion. She looked at Simone with the forthright assessment of a child who has been watching adults for signs of trustworthiness all day. Are you still being unhelpful? Bea asked. Simone blinked. Then, for the first time that day, she laughed. A real laugh, not the managed kind. No, she said. I think I'm doing better. Good, Bea said, and went back to her appetizers. The finalists were announced at 8 o'clock that evening. 5 entries advancing from a field of 32. Henry's name was third on the list. Bea, who had been asleep in the hotel room for an hour by then, didn't hear him read it, but he sat on the edge of the bed in the dim light from the desk lamp and read it twice quietly to himself and to no one. Morning came with the flat gray light of San Francisco November. Henry was awake by 5:30, sitting at the small desk with his notebook, reviewing details he already knew. Bea slept until 7, then ate a hotel waffle with focused efficiency and declared herself ready. The finals were held in the hotel's main conference room, a formal space with rows of chairs for observers and a long judge's table at the front. The 5 finalists sat along one wall, their entries displayed on a table behind them. Henry's bag sat between an architectural leather portfolio from a Chicago studio and a structured tote from the Paris house, whose representative had finally introduced himself at breakfast and turned out to be a very nervous man named Felix who kept adjusting his collar. Simone was on the judges' panel. She had disclosed in the morning briefing that she'd spoken with one of the exhibitors the previous evening and recused herself from individual scoring on his entry to avoid any appearance of bias. She'd been direct about it, matter of fact, no drama. The lead judge had nodded and updated the protocols accordingly. Henry noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed, the room filled, buyers from department stores and specialty retailers, journalists with press credentials, several people who had the precise, watchful demeanor of intellectual property attorneys. And in the back corner, the Brooklyn Studios founder, Jess, who gave him a small nod when he looked her way. The presentations were 20 minutes each, with 10 minutes of questions. Henry was scheduled 4th. He watched the first 3. The Chicago studio presented a portfolio system with modular inserts. Innovative, technically precise, clearly designed for a corporate buyer. The Paris house offered a structured bag in hand-dyed exotic leather, the kind of thing that photographed beautifully and carried a price point that required justification. A New York collective showed a line of minimalist pieces made from reclaimed leather, which the judges engaged with seriously for the question period. All 3 were excellent. Henry was aware of this without letting himself be discouraged by it. When his name was called, Bea walked to the front of the room with him without asking permission. He hadn't planned for this. The lead judge looked slightly surprised. Henry glanced at Bea, who looked back with the expression of someone who has already decided. He pulled a second chair to the edge of the presentation area, and she sat in it, hands folded in her lap, watching. He began. 4 years ago, he said, my wife Ruth was diagnosed with ALS. She was 59 years old. We had been married for 34 years. We had a daughter and 3 grandchildren, and a house in Harlan County, where I had been making leather goods in the backyard shed since before any of our kids were born. The room was quiet. When Ruth got sick, I needed something to hold on to. I'd always made practical things. Saddles, tool rolls, belts, work goods. Things that got used hard and were supposed to last. But I started thinking about what it would mean to make something that lasted, not because it was tough, but because it was right. Because every decision in it was the correct decision and there were no compromises anywhere. He paused. That became an obsession. And obsessions are useful when everything else is falling apart. He walked them through the bag. The sourcing of the hide, 3 trips to Montana, conversations with the rancher about the animal's life and diet and how that affected hide quality, the selection of a specific piece from a specific area of a specific bison. The tanning process he'd spent 2 years developing, adjusting the bark ratios by season, tracking how temperature affected the result. The stitching, he'd made a custom awl, retooled a stitching pony his grandfather had built in 1962, practiced the 18 per inch rhythm until his hands could do it in the dark. The hardware took the longest to get right, he said. I worked with a metalsmith in Corbin for almost a year on just the closure, the weight of the latch, the resistance of the hinge, the sound it makes when it closes. He looked at the judges. A bag is touched hundreds of times before it's ever carried. Before someone buys it, they pick it up, they open it, they close it. Every time they do that, they're deciding whether to trust it. I wanted every one of those moments to feel right. A hand went up from the judges' panel. The lead judge, a woman named Dr. Christine Park, who chaired the craft division of a National Design Institute, leaned forward. Mr. Baird, Your process suggests a production timeline of, what, 18 months per piece? About that, for a bag of this complexity. I can do simpler pieces faster. That's not commercially viable at any meaningful scale. No, Henry agreed, it's not. A ripple went through the room. He waited for it to settle. What I make is not meant to be scaled, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to launch a brand or open a studio. I'm here because my wife told me the work deserved to be seen. And because I think there's a category of making that we've almost entirely lost in this industry, where every decision is the right decision, where nothing is compromised for efficiency or cost or timeline, where the object is built as if it's going to outlive everyone in this room. He looked at the judges. I think it matters that this kind of making still exists, even if it can't scale, even if it's just one person in a shed in Tennessee who finishes 2 bags a year. The room was quiet again. 2 bags a year, the retail buyer from yesterday's panel said slowly. He was seated in the observer section now. What do you charge? $12,000. Another ripple. And do you? I have a waiting list of 14 months, Henry said. I've never advertised. Every client has come from someone who touched the previous bag. Dr. Park looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a note. The questions continued for the full 10 minutes. He answered everything directly, without hedging, the commercial limitations of his process, the fact that he had no desire to hire employees or move to a larger space, the reality that what he made existed outside the normal commercial logic of the industry. He was not apologetic about any of it. When it was over, he walked back to his chair. Bea slipped her hand into his. Was that good? She whispered. I think we told the truth, he said. That's all I can do. The panel deliberated for 40 minutes. The audience waited with the specific energy of a room that knows something significant is about to happen, but isn't sure what shape it will take. Simone, seated at the judge's table with her recusal noted in the record, did not deliberate on Henry's entry. But she watched the room during the wait period, and what she saw was unusual. People were not doing the normal things people did at these events, checking phones, networking in the aisles, doing the subtle social calculation of who to talk to next. Most of them were sitting quietly. Several were looking at Henry's bag on the display table. A few were looking at Bea, who had found her sketchbook again and was drawing horses with complete serenity, as if none of the adults around her were particularly interesting. Dr. Park returned to the room first, and the quiet settled into something deeper. The judges have reached a decision, she said. I want to say before we announce it that this was not a simple deliberation. We had 5 entries of exceptional quality, and the discussion was genuinely difficult. She looked at her notes. The summit's top prize in the independent artisan category is awarded to the entry that best represents the standard of craft we believe this industry should aspire to. Not necessarily the most commercially viable, not the most innovative in a technical sense, but the most complete expression of what it means to make something right. She looked up. This year, that award goes to Henry Baird. The applause was not polite. It was the kind of applause that meant something, the kind that started in a few places and spread because people were joining it because they wanted to, not because it was expected. The Chicago studio founder started it. Jess from Brooklyn followed immediately. The Paris House's Felix clapped with an expression of genuine relief, as if he'd been hoping for this outcome without admitting it to himself. Bea stopped drawing. Grandpa, she said carefully, did we win? Henry's voice came out more unsteady than he intended. Yeah, sweetheart, we did. She threw her arms around him with the full force of an 8-year-old who has been containing her feelings for 2 days, and he held on and let himself feel it. The thing he'd been holding at a careful distance since Ruth died, the possibility that the work she'd told him to show the world had actually, genuinely, been worth showing. Dr. Park approached while the room was still processing. She shook Henry's hand with both of hers. I've been on this panel for 11 years, she said. That presentation is going to be talked about. She paused. Your wife knew what she was talking about. She usually did. The award came with a plaque, a monetary prize, and significantly, an invitation to be featured in the summit's annual showcase publication, which was distributed to every major luxury retailer in the country. Henry held the check and looked at the number on it, which was substantial. He felt its weight in a way that had nothing to do with money. After the formal proceedings, the room reorganized into the loose post-decision social energy of people who had just witnessed something and wanted to talk about it. Henry was at the center of more conversations than he could track. Buyers wanted to know about the waiting list. Journalists asked about the tanning process. Other artisans, who'd been watching from the observer section, sought him out to tell him they were glad he'd entered. Simone found him near the display table 20 minutes after the announcement. She looked at the bag sitting in its place between the Chicago and Paris entries, and then at him. Congratulations, she said. It was a simple word, and she meant it simply. Thank you. And thank you for yesterday evening. I meant what I said. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about what you told me, about your wife, about hiding. She looked at the bag again. I think I've been hiding something too, in a different way. Building a brand around being the person who recognizes quality. But somewhere along the line, I started filtering everything through commercial viability first. Whether something can scale, whether it will photograph, whether it will perform in the market. I stopped asking whether it was right. She paused. Your presentation reminded me what right looks like. You built something, Henry said. That's not nothing. 23 people have jobs because of you. I know. I'm not dismissing that. She smiled slightly. I just think I needed to see a bison leather bag that took 14 months to tan, made by someone who tested the sound of the latch for a year, to remember why I started doing this. She looked at Bia, who had resumed drawing and was now apparently working on a horse wearing a hat. Your granddaughter is something else, by the way. She has her grandmother's instincts. Good instincts to have. They were interrupted by a buyer from a boutique chain in New York, who had been trying to reach Henry for the past 10 minutes, and Simone stepped back to let it happen. Before she moved away, she said quietly, "Get a lawyer before you sign anything, and call me when you're ready to talk through your options. I know people who can help you protect what you've built without having to compromise it." It was the last thing Henry expected from her, and perhaps the most useful. He didn't call her for 6 weeks. He went home to Harlan County, finished the second bag on his current commission, drove Bea to school in the mornings, and sat in the shed at night with the award plaque on the workbench and tried to figure out what he actually wanted. The waiting list grew from 14 months to 3 years in the weeks after the summit's publication came out. He had 47 new inquiries from buyers he'd never heard of. A feature piece ran in a craft magazine that had a circulation of 60,000 readers. He thought about what Ruth would have said. He thought he knew. When he finally called Simone, she picked up on the second ring. "I've been wondering when you'd call," she said. "I needed to think. That seems like the right approach. What did you decide?" "I don't want to scale," he said. "I don't want employees or investors or a brand strategy. I want to keep making 2 bags a year the right way. And I want people to be able to find me, and I want to do it without getting eaten alive by people who think the point is something other than the object." "Okay," Simone said. "I think I can help with that." What she had in mind wasn't an acquisition or a partnership in the conventional sense. She had relationships with a small number of boutique retailers who represented independent craftspeople on consignment terms that preserved the maker's pricing authority and didn't require production commitments. She also knew an intellectual property attorney who specialized in craft and design, someone who could help Henry protect his tanning process and his hardware designs from being appropriated by larger houses that had already been asking questions. She helped him navigate the conversations. She didn't try to own any part of the outcome. "Why are you doing this?" he asked her once, during a phone call that had run an hour longer than he expected. "Because I can," she said simply, "and because my father's furniture is in a storage unit in Indiana. Nobody's ever going to see it. I can't fix that. But I can make sure yours isn't." The words stayed with him. By the following spring, Henry had a small but solid presence in 4 boutique galleries, each of which presented his work with the full story of its making. He had legal protection for his tanning formula and his hardware designs. He had a website, simple, unhurried, the work photographed in the shed where it was made that had been built by a neighbor's kid in exchange for a custom belt. His waiting list was now 4 years. He had turned down a reality television proposal, a licensing inquiry from a fast fashion house, and an offer from a private equity firm that had used the word democratize 3 times in the opening paragraph of their email. He kept the plaque on the workbench. He kept Ruth's photo next to it. Bea came to the shed on Saturday mornings, and he was teaching her to stitch. She had her own awl, sized for her hands. She practiced on scraps, slowly, counting under her breath, her tongue between her teeth in concentration. She had the patience for it. She had always had her grandmother's patience. "Grandpa," she said one Saturday, examining a seam she'd just finished, "when I'm grown up, can I make bags too? You can make whatever you want, but can I make bags like yours?" He looked at the seam she'd done. The stitches were uneven, but they were trying to be even. They were the stitches of someone who understood what even looked like. "I think you can make bags better than mine," he said. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I want to make them like yours first," she said, "and then better." He thought that was exactly right. A year after the summit, Simone called to tell him she was stepping back from Beaumont's studio, not closing it, not selling it, but restructuring so that her design director could lead operations while she shifted her focus. She was starting something new. A small fund, or less a fund than a support structure, for independent craftspeople who needed help protecting their work and finding the right markets without being pressured to compromise their process. "You're the reason," she said when he asked. "I didn't do anything. You showed up with a cardboard box," she said, "and you made something that couldn't be dismissed, and I almost dismissed it. I've been thinking about that for a year." She paused. "I want to spend the next part of my career making sure people like you don't have to fight as hard as you did just to be taken seriously." Henry held the phone for a moment in the shed, tools around him, the November light coming in gray through the small window. "Ruth would like you," he said. "I hope so," Simone said. "I think she sounds like someone I'd want to know." He looked at the workbench, the plaque, the photo, the half-finished bag in the clamp, the new hide pinned to the wall, the small awl he'd made for Bea hanging next to his own. "She was the one who told me to stop hiding," he said. "Everything after that is just following directions." It was the truest thing he'd said in a long time, and it sat right the way a well-made thing does. Complete, with nothing left over, nothing missing, balanced in the hand like something built to last.